Did you know we have three brains? Yeah, it's probably a bit of a surprise to you. We all know that we have the mind brain, but today we're going to learn about our two other brains and how to connect with them. In this COVID pandemic, we've become very disconnected from probably our two other brains, but not disconnected from our mind brain. We've been using lots of our mind brain, and certainly the media very much appeal to the mind brain and getting it all concerned and fearful. So today we have Traci Philips, who's an executive leadership and performance coach from the US, joining us to discuss these three brains. So welcome to another episode of Me and My Health Up. I'm your host, Anthony Hartcher. I'm a clinical nutritionist and lifestyle medicine specialist. And here we have Traci Philips, all the way from the US. How are you, Traci?
I'm doing well, Anthony. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Thanks for joining us. And I'll start with my usual question, which is how you've arrived at what you're doing today.
Yeah. So, it's like in life, we take twists and turns. And, my previous career before coaching was actually as a program developer, implementer for foreign language in the elementary level at schools. And so that really kind of started me as a lifetime learner on how people learn, right? How people pick up information and then how they utilize that. And so I bring that into my coaching today, but how I got to working with specifically visionaries as a leadership and performance coach is I had an opportunity to do a 3-year stint at the federal prison system here in the state I'm living in, North Carolina. And doing that, I worked with ex-executives, right? So these were, very successful people who had gone out of integrity with themselves as people, as leaders. And why was that? Why did that happen? And then helping them find their way back home, so to speak, to their integrity, to their authenticity, and to that place that they wanted to really perform from as leaders. And so that was a wonderful opportunity to kind of hone my skill set and really develop a passion for working with that group of people. And not necessarily people in prison. I work with those before they get to that point of making decisions that might take them out of, away from what, matters for them the most.
And what generally does take them away from what matters to them the most?
A lot of it is what you talked about, even when you were talking about the media and how conditioned we are. When we're in fear, we're easily controlled, right? And a lot of times the conditioning is really what came up, the expected or, perceived expectations that these leaders felt, others had of them, what they had of themselves, how you were supposed to be as a leader, what was expected of you, of your people, but of the industry, of the world, really. And so we're operating so much on external expectations of which we're not even completely sure to begin with, right? They're perceived. It can be kind of a hairy deal because we're not making decisions based on who we truly are and what we truly want and what's in integrity or alignment with us. We're trying to align ourselves with what we think other people want from us. And, the more we get out of that lane, of again, personal integrity, the easier it is for us to make decisions and that lead to actions and circumstances that, then start to snowball. So that's really a lot of it stemmed from the fact that people were living, focused outwardly, which we many times all are. And that's kind of really the nature of the work that I do, is trying to get people to look in and come back home, to that kind of internal, intrinsic motivator within us, the part of us that knows, who we are, what we came for, and, and how that needs to look so that we are in alignment with ourselves.
And do you find that a particular gender is more, troubled by this than the other?
That's a really good question. I don't tend to look as much with gender as I do with personality and kind of, where people, one of the things I listen for is through the language, where are the gaps? So when people are communicating with me, I'm listening for two main things. I'm listening for their zone of genius, right? What is that genius piece within them? But also, where are those gaps of belief, right? Where are people lying to themselves, about who they are, what other things mean, what's value to them, all of those types of things. I can hear when it doesn't align with truth, right? Their particular truth. So, I focus less on the gender piece and more on this, the individual piece. But I work mostly with men Actually, the last school that I taught at was an all boys school. I really enjoyed that, and learning kind of how the male mind thinks. I find that particular puzzle really fascinating. So when I was in the federal prison system, I worked all with men. It was a male program. And so that's kind of, I guess there can be individual differences between the genders, but, I really focus more, like I said, on the individual, and I work mostly with men. So it's hard to kind of compare those two.
How about the men in terms of what you've found and how they think, and how you found that really fascinating?
Well, one of the things that I heard a long time ago, I was actually I was at a networking event, and the keynote speaker was fascinating to me. And she was sharing a body of research that had come from a woman's book. And I can't remember if I really need to get this information so that I can quote it directly. But basically, this woman talked about pie and cake. She was using the analogy of men prefer pie and women prefer cake, and pie and cake are analogies. And the pie part, I guess, stood for, if I can remember correctly, performance, image, and exposure. Right. So when men are in a leadership position, or in charge of things, they're focused on those three things: performance, image, and exposure. The most. Women, cake was more, what we typically call the soft skills: compassion, attitude. K, I think, if I remember correctly, was something like kinetics, that the kind of kinetic way in which we energetically align and connect. And E was empathy, right? So when women are leading, they're focused more on those particular pieces, according to this woman's research and experience. And I thought that was really interesting, because what she was basically saying is that when you're coaching or mentoring or working with men and women, understanding that these different places of focus and importance, needs to be understood. Otherwise, it may be difficult for you to support that particular gender.
I wonder how much of the pie, in terms of the men, is influenced by that societal macho, masculine stereotype.
Yeah, well, and it is throughout history that has kind of been the leadership model, right? And we're seeing this big shift. That's why people are, talking more about the soft form leadership. Empathy is so important, compassion is so important. Talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, these are more typically those female-oriented focus points. And yet we have masculine and feminine energy in all of us, whether we're a man or whether we're a woman. And so really finding that place, the masculine energy is more about action. It has been typically, when we've been warring with one another over the ages, a leader, needs to be a strong, action-oriented individual. At least that's what historically we've needed. Well, as things have shifted, we're more tech-based and less, hand and fist based. The needs for different kinds of leadership have changed. As it used to be, even in the professional world, it was mostly a man's world, and if women entered it, they almost had to take on the more masculine qualities or the more masculine approaches to leadership in order to be taken seriously. And so this is all very, in a very large shift right now, where we're seeing, more and more women taking leadership positions, high level leadership positions, and also just what leadership is asking for currently in today's world, with COVID and everything going on, and more of a spotlight placed on mental health, and, making sure that we're aligned, with what we love and the passions that we have for life, and our, career focus and all of that. Nobody was asking those questions necessarily, at least on a large scale, 10 years ago. And so as those things change, the leadership needs change. And so it is really fascinating. It's actually, always what we see and what manifests is a sign of our kind of mental focus and what is becoming more and more important to us, based on the experiences that we're having and the developmental place we're at, as a culture.
And just on that depending on what's happening in the environment or what the company's going through, the transformation or where the company's at, I can imagine cake is needed in certain situations or is better type of leadership in certain situations, and pie is a better type of leadership in certain situations. And I'm thinking pie is very much that crisis mode, from what I understand. But then when things are out of crisis mode and it's a matter of maybe it's a bit of status quo and growth, then it's probably more the cake model to take people with you. Am I right in that, or is it too simplistic in my thinking?
Well, I think you're right in the sense that, certain types of approaches in leadership, are determined by the particular situation, that's at hand, and I always like to say it's kind of even with the health model, you've got typical Western medical ways, and then you have the more Eastern alternative approaches that are about supporting the body to do what the body is meant to do, which is heal. And create homeostasis. And so, like if I'm bleeding because I got hit by a car and I'm bleeding on the side of the road, don't take me to an acupuncturist, but, take me to a hospital. But at the same time, if I am in a position where I'm trying to maintain my health or I'm trying to improve my health, I'm not in crisis, but I could, get better, for those things, I wouldn't want to be taking medicine or, go to a hospital, to use drugs or surgery to, improve and support my body again, to heal, because that model is not going to support me to do that. So it's not that one or the other is better. It is the circumstantial, I think, needs that, are being called for. But now what we're seeing is, because that there's been, so little of a focus on, again, I keep using the word soft skills, which I really need to stop because I don't know what else to call it. So it's what we've been calling it, but they aren't soft skills. They're actually incredibly, critical skills, is to be able to be human with one another and communicate that, in a way that builds connection and trust and rapport. Because again, that's the human part of us. And, any business is essentially made up of humans. And so how we act from a human standpoint is very important in supporting that, obviously to build cultures that are going to, allow people to be happy and productive and, keep attrition rates low and productivity high. We really do need to be aware of these things and understand as leaders and just as, individuals who are a part of these cultures, what exactly allows for more of that and what takes away from that.
And in terms of the pie, relating it back to the three brains that I mentioned at the start, would the pie model be more operating in that mind brain, and then the cake model is more the connection of the three brains? Would that be right, or too simplistic?
Yeah, well, and I think the cake is very much heart-based, the emotional-based, as well as, even intuition or gut, instinctive-based. I think both really are instinctive because, some of the greatest, even male leaders throughout time, what set them apart from others and why they were great was because a lot of times, even when it flew in the face of rational, understanding, they would follow their instincts. They would follow their gut. They would make gut decisions. And so really there's we can see examples of that throughout history, non-dependent on the gender of the leader. But I think, yes, when we are looking at things like performance, how people are seeing that I am, how well I'm doing, image, well, that's an obvious one, how I look to others. And exposure is both how much exposure am I getting? So in other words, mentorship, how prepared am I, to go into this leadership role? If I'm being mentored by another leader, how well am I being exposed to those things I'm going to need to know when I step into that larger leadership role? But exposure can also be how much of me is exposed. I think we typically throughout history in leadership have been kind of anti transparency. It's been all about just only showing, it's like that Facebook thing, only showing what you want people to see. And now we're replacing that with, the big V word, vulnerability, and showing who you truly are and showing your weaknesses as well as your strengths. That's a huge shift. I even know in my years as teaching, we're really taught not to show not to let them see you sweat, so to speak. And if you didn't know something, you had to kind of, pretend in some ways or position yourself in a way where, you could focus on what you did know and then, go back and find out, behind the scenes. But, no, everybody can pick that up these days. I mean, I think we're becoming more awakened and aware, to those types of tactics, and leaders just can't get away with that anymore. But, even though that's changing quickly, we're still kind of, in many ways, at least the leaders I talk to, still in the old school model. It's like, but I'm not supposed to let people see me sweat. I'm not supposed to show that I have weakness. I'm not supposed, they don't know quite yet how to be that vulnerable person while also not showing and hanging out all their dirty laundry, because there's that happy medium. It doesn't mean you just fall apart. That's not vulnerability, as Brene Brown said. That's stupidity. But it's, I do feel that each part kind of, again, plays its role. But yes, I would say that more the focus on, the image kind of based things are more head based, for sure.
And there's probably a bit more ego in the pie than in the cake, I'd say.
Yeah, well, that's where ego resides, right? That's where ego is triggered, is in our thoughts. I mean, everything starts kind of with the meaning we give things, right? And so the ego is all about self-protection. And so if we give something a narrative or a story that dictates that we need to protect ourselves from that thing, then that's what triggers the ego kind of into its fight, flee, freeze or faint, mode. We develop these kind of reactive qualities, in order to protect ourselves.
And so we've talked about the mind brain, or working, from the mind in terms of our analytics and seeing things as black and white. And then you've mentioned that the heart in terms of that compassion, that human side, that vulnerability side, and then that gut instinct. So if you could just sort of shed some light as to the definitions when we're talking about the three brains, and then we'll get into how people can better align the three brains or just tune into them and at least I guess send signals and talk to them or whatever, and how they bring out the best in terms of what's needed in certain situations.
Absolutely. So there is if you're really interested kind of more in the physical or science-based three brain, it's neuroscience really that discovered these three brains. And they basically found these kind of clumps of cellular structures in our heads, in our heart region, and in our gut, right, our digestive region, that mimicked each other, right, that they are literally the same cell structures, and that they found that they communicated back and forth. And which is why a lot of times now they're finding, there's a lot of research on mental health and digestive health, a direct correlation between the two. People with digestive issues actually also showing signs of mental issues or mental decline, and vice versa. Those who are showing mental decline also actually, have digestive issues. And because our immune system resides mostly in our gut, that makes a lot of sense in many ways. And also heart health is connected to those two other healths, mental health and digestive health as well. So we can see that this actually is a thing. But there's a great book by an ND, naturopathic doctor, Karen Jensen, called The Three Brains, that goes through this neuroscience and kind of what each brain is and how it works, again, more from that physical science standpoint. In leadership, I've been developing a model for a while, that helps leaders understand how to utilize these, because like I like to point out to people, it isn't just neuroscience and it isn't just that physical. Yes, we need health in these three areas, and yes, it's all connected. But as leaders, in order to kind of encapsulate the different needs, but also the different information that we need to be kind of breaking down and utilizing to make the decisions that we make as leaders, it is important to understand that we're not just accessing information from one brain. I like to make it very simple by saying, if we have three brains, let's just say a third, and a third. If there's 3/3 available information out there, there's a third of it that can be accessed through our head brain, and a third through our heart brain, and a third through our gut brain. If we're only focusing on accessing information from our head brain, then at best, we're accessing a third of the available information. And I always like to say to leaders, I don't know about you, but if I have 3/3 of the available information available, but I'm only accessing a third, then, whatever decisions I'm making at best are going to be, a third of the way, I guess, as far as good decisions, I can only make, 75% of the time make really great decision, or 25% of the time, make really good decisions. And that is not good enough for me, right? If I can access 3/3 in order to make those decisions, I'm going to want to do that. But each brain accesses information differently. So, it's not like, oh, I know how to think. We can't utilize that same, we can't access information the same way through our hearts and through our guts. And so it really there's a different access and approach point for getting that information from each of the brains.
So I certainly, the mind brain's registering information from all the senses. And I'm just thinking of the other two brains, like that heart brain very much picks up on that aura, sort of that energy that's coming, whether it be good. When someone walks into a room, they either bring great energy or they take energy. And I'm thinking is that the heart brain that really connects with the person's aura or persona. And then the gut is that intuitive thing. And I think we talk a lot about connecting with that intuition, but we struggle to connect with it. So I'm really fascinated as to, I think we have a clear understanding of, and we spend too much in our mind brains, particularly around leadership. I'm thinking, how do we connect more with our heart brain and our gut brain, and where do we access the information from, and how do we tune into it?
Yeah, those are all great questions. And, that intellect piece, so I call it, the IQ, EQ, and PQ, right? So IQ obviously is the head brain, and that's also too where we have subscribed most of our value, right? What is your IQ? You have a high IQ, you're smarter, you have more value to offer, all of that. And so really there has been this deep conditioning around looking at, what, do you have a doctorate? Do you have what credentials do you have? Everything is based on that intellectual capacity that we have. And so really understanding, and I think thankfully, because we're hearing more about the emotional, aspects of being a leader, at least in the leadership world, that has opened the door to start to have these conversations like we're having today. But, whereas IQ is that intellectual capacity, EQ is that emotional capacity, right? How well can we truly connect? Because people think they're connecting intellectually. Oh, I'm connecting with you because we're speaking and we're understanding one another. Meanwhile, you may not be, like you were saying, the energetics, you may not be feeling me at all. You may be understanding my words, but you're not getting anything from me. And a great example of that actually is a story that happened to me a number of years ago. This is, I think, back in 2012. I was approached by a gentleman. I was about to give a presentation, and he had done his due diligence and research, and he thought he might want to work with me as a coach. And when he came up to me after I had done my presentation, he handed me his business card and said, "Well, I've chosen not to work with you. And if you would like to know why, give me a call." And he walked away. And I was left standing there like, what just happened? What between that initial conversation, my presentation, and now? And of course, my curiosity was stronger than my ego. And so I had coffee with him. And what he said to me was really, probably changed the trajectory of my life and my coaching. He said, "You weren't accessible to me. Your intellect was strong. You said all the right things. You gave the right presence. Your Q&A was on point." He said, "I couldn't feel you. I didn't feel your emotional, connectiveness." And as a person now in my 60s, at the time he was in his 60s, he said, "I'm looking for a coach because that's what I'm struggling with. I need a coach to help me access that emotional human aspect to myself as a leader because I think it's important." He was ahead of his time. And he says, "You don't have it, so you can't help me." And that was so important for me to hear and see and understand, because although I didn't know how that came to be, and then that he was pointing out something I wasn't aware of before, once I became aware of it, I was able to ask the right questions and eventually find my way into that emotional, heart-based, where have I shut that down? And I mean, it was a deep dive that's been going on since 2012 that has really offered me a lot of insightful information about myself and, just how I developed over my life, and really focused on developing that EQ, that emotional quotient, which is so important to being able to, truly help and support people the way they want and need to be supported.
And that could be quite common. Not that I know it is, but I'm just thinking, if I'm, like in terms of that gender, the female perspective, over the last few decades, it's all about having to break through that ceiling or break down the limitations. And to do that, females have really seen, well, I just got to be more like men. I got to be tough. I got to be, I can't show the sweat. I got to push through and show that I can do this and I can withstand all this pressure and I've got what it takes. And I'm thinking you probably went through that growing up and, through your learning, and then you hit this point where EQ was so important, but you've lost that connection with the EQ part that innately is strong in women. And I'm thinking there's probably quite a number of women, around, I guess, our generation that would be struggling with that because they've had to really push aside the EQ, become IQ dominant, but now realise that the world switched to EQ. It's all about EQ, and that's would I be right in that assessment, or?
Oh, for sure. I think for women who, all of us as human beings, we've lost it because that was not what was focused on and what was expected of us. And, I always like to point out to people, there's a big difference between understanding and developing your emotionality and being emotional, right? So because a lot of times it was like, oh, women in business, they're too emotional. Which, first of all human beings were meant to have an emotional aspect to our personalities and to our beings. And so, to say, oh, we're being emotional. Well, yes, we're being human. But the fact that that's cut out, I think it's very telling when we look things up in the dictionary. A number of years ago, I was writing a blog, and I always like to kind of look up the derivation of words. And I was this idea of emoting, right? Emoting, just showing emotion that we're actually feeling. And when you look it up in any American dictionary, it doesn't just say the show of emotion, which is really what emoting means. There's always an adjective attached to it, the overshow of emotion, the exaggerated show of emotion, the overdramatic show of emotion. I'm like, where did we somehow define it as over the top to show emotion? But that says a lot. Here in the States, we were founded by a bunch of Puritans, so at the end of the day, we really get to look back at things histrionically speaking and say, oh, we got to this point of thinking we needed to shut these things down because one, life was hard, and two, this was what was expected to get by and show strength. But we're in a different time, and showing strength looks different. And we recognize that because we're emerging, right? We're awakening, we're understanding more. They used to think the world was flat. We used to think, that the brain only had, was one full hemisphere. There weren't hemispheres. It was just one piece. But as we dive in and we do more research and we look further, we discover more. And I think that's where we are in leadership right now. And certainly with the understanding of these brains, anybody who's been able to keep their instinctive qualities open, that was the one thing that I might have been over intellectualizing my emotions most of my life. But I always allowed my gut to lead. And I think that saved me in a lot of situations. And so that's what I basically teach leaders, is how do we start to, understand how and what each brain accesses. And so one of the things, the exercises I like to introduce people to is it's very simple. The head brain is what I'm thinking. The heart brain is what I'm feeling. And the gut brain is what I'm sensing. So if we're dealing with a situation where we want to access information from each of our brains, and it's a great writing exercise actually as well, is that, okay, this particular situation I'm dealing with, what am I thinking about it? right? And write that down. And then, we do some kind of what I call neutralizing exercises, jumping up and down and doing the cross, and that kind of is like wiping the slate clean. And then what am I feeling? And it does help to put your hands over your heart, because that kinesthetically speaking reminds the body of where, or tapping it very lightly. Where am I accessing this information? What am I feeling about this? Right. And then we write that down. And then we do our clearing, and then, tapping on the gut. What am I sensing about this? And, it does take practice. It's, I have very few people who just got it right out of the gate. But doing this as often as we can is a very powerful exercise that will start to develop our ability to discern the difference in those three areas. The funny thing is many times when I'm asking clients questions, like I'll say, I'm hearing that they're having a hard time accessing the let's say the emotional brain. I'll say, so what do you feel? And their response, well, I think. Well, no, not what do you think? What do you feel? Well, I think I feel, and it'll always come out in the language where people are accessing information from. And that'll also show where we might be challenged in it as well. Sensing tends to be hard for people. They're wanting to think about it. Like, what are you sensing? And sometimes it's good to think, to sense in things that aren't thoughts. So in other words, is there a color that's coming up for you, right? Is there a shape? Do you feel something somewhere in your body, right? You don't have to define it with words, because that oftentimes has a going up into the head brain, but that you can access it more in things that are non-linguistically inclined. And not make meaning out of it. Just take it at face value. Oh, I'm sensing the color black, and I'm sensing it in my gut. Okay, we don't have to figure out what that means. Let's just write it down. And then over time, we can start to translate, what that might mean to us, and at the very least, where we're holding blocked information.
And where do you find, is there generally a tendency for people to be blocked in certain areas more so than other areas?
For sure. And what's really interesting is I can sense that in people when I'm just with them, is that, all of a sudden, I think one of my funny stories is that one day I was getting ready for a client call, and I started to have just there was this pit in my stomach, and I thought, I'm not hungry, and I didn't just eat something that's not agreeing with me. And I couldn't figure out what it was that was coming up energetically. And then I got on my phone call, and, upon asking my client how he was doing, he said, well, I've been struggling with this thing, and I have this pit in my stomach. And I thought, oh, that's where that was coming from. We do have the ability, and I think the more I know I do this work with myself, the more clear I get to being kind of that catalyst of sorts, to be able to read other people's energy and where that is and where that's coming from. Sometimes I will feel it in my own chest, and I know that something's blocked in their EQ, right, their emotional quotient region. So I'll ask questions about that. And so we can capitalize and utilize that. So it's not just for ourselves. We can certainly start to learn how, to develop this in order to offer assistance to others in that way as well.
It's fascinating. It's I've truly learned a lot through chatting with you, and it's really great to explore these three areas, three brain areas that we generally, as you said, we only think we're thinking, and doing too much thinking and less perceiving and feeling. And we need to, as you said, we need to access the 3/4, or not the 3/4, the 3/3, is it? Then 3/3, the whole.
There might be a fourth that we don't know about yet.
Yeah, I was just thinking it's that sixth sense. So is there some parting words you'd like to share with the listeners before we wrap up?
Well, I just, I first of all, we could talk forever. I think the two of us get together and there's just so much to share. That if people are interested in this kind of thing, I think more and more it's gone less from, the woo-woo world, where it's just like, oh, that sounds a little bit interesting. I'm not sure what to think of it. And really to use it, because one of the main things that I do as a coach is to take those things, those modalities that have been kind of on the periphery and bring them into mainstream, right? How can we start to access this? Because, as I say to clients, even when they're a little bit on the edge, I'm like, it's just going to be an experiment. Let's just try it out and see what happens. You don't have to fully, buy into it. You don't have to, let's just play a game, and see. And sometimes we need to approach it that way with ourselves because again, our head brain will be like, that doesn't rationally make sense to me. So I'm going to shut that down. And so I just invite people to kind of look at life in general as an experiment. If something resonates, your head might be shouting, oh, no, this is weird, strange, back off. But pay attention to your other two brains too, because they may be saying something different. Your heart brain, if you're just like, something resonates. I mean, it was like when that man was telling me he didn't want to work with me, my head brain immediately went to, who does he think he is? It's like the ego kind of reaction. But my heart was actually felt very aligned. I knew that there was something there that was important. And that's what overrode my head in the end, that I really felt I needed, that I needed to know, I needed to feel. And well, it was my heart brain that needed that support. So because I was listening to other aspects of me, I was able to capitalize on that incredibly important gift. And so I would just invite people that, even if there's some resistance to information from one of your brains, open up your other brains and see, if they have something different to share. And if there's even an inkling, it always, again, we don't have to buy in 100%. We can just look at it as a game and an experiment and see what we can find, because we might just find something that we're going to be really glad we went looking.
And I can imagine some people are really blocked because of a traumatic experience that they've just shut down. Like, so a huge breakup or, a significant breakup, has really hurt the heart. And so the feeling is, you sort of don't want to connect too much to the heart because it hurts too much. And so then they very much shift to the more thinking, but they're not being true to themselves there because just don't want to. I guess it's a protective mechanism, isn't it, when we go through these sort of life traumas, and that would come out in your work, right? In terms of why people just really can't tune into there's really a big block, and then just not allowing themselves to really feel or perceive.
And that's more when we bring the emotionality up into the head, because again, when we truly just allow ourselves to feel, it actually passes through us very quickly. Our emotions are like a wind, a gust of wind that comes in. And again, we've kind of learned, we've conditioned ourselves to think that, the only thing that keeps an emotion constantly feeding through our system is our head, not our heart. If we allow ourselves to feel that grief or feel that loss or feel it at the time that we're experiencing it, it doesn't last. It's the narrative that keeps it, kind of recycling through our system, right? And the narrative comes from the story we're telling in our heads. So that's the other thing too. And I always tell people, obviously I stay in my lane, as a coach, with the focus that I have, but that's why it's so important that we know each other, right? We know the various different individuals that can help support that. And, somebody really does get triggered in something traumatic, it's always important to get the right support to help with that. But I do tell people, and I do, welcome them into that space of getting that support, because otherwise, we think that just because we don't acknowledge it or address it, it goes away. That's not true. We just continue to carry it along with us, and it builds over time, right? Because then other triggered events add on top of it, and we're not then addressing any of that. And so it is important, but we feel to heal too. So if there's parts of our bodies that aren't healing, a lot of it's because of pent up emotion that we haven't addressed.
Wow, it's fascinating work you do, and it's great work and so much needed, because I can see if we're not addressing these three brains and connecting with them, then that would physically manifest itself in terms of disease and illness. And so I think that inner work that you do with people is truly special in terms of helping them to optimal health. It's fantastic. It's been so insightful chatting with you, Traci. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure the listeners have really learned a lot. And so I really appreciate your time in part, sharing your wisdom. And to the listeners, I really thank you for tuning in to another insightful episode of Me and My Health Up. Thank you.